The amount of money being hidden in tax havens around the world amounts to trillions of dollars.
I propose getting rid of non-dom status, and that is something that we are looking at as a Labour Party.
My name's Anna Isaac. I'm economics editor here at The Independent. My job ranges right from covering the cost of living crisis, the huge increase in inflation we're seeing in the UK, right through to following the money through the City of London, right through into Westminster and the people who are in power. One of my recent stories here at The Independent was writing about the tax affairs of Rishi Sunak's wife, Akshata Murty. This included revealing that she had used non-domicile status for her taxes. Non-dom is an old piece of UK legislation that originally evolved a couple of hundred years ago to accommodate the financial structures that supported plantations when we were linked between the City of London and the global slave trade. Non-dom status is an entirely legitimate part of the British tax system, but what it has done is it saved Miss Murty millions of pounds on her tax bill. And so revealing it just as the Chancellor was increasing taxes for ordinary people day to day provoked quite a strong response from the public. Your domicile is normally defined by where you would make your permanent home. To qualify for non-dom status and then choose to use it for minimising your tax bill is normally dependent on where your father's born. So in the case of Akshata Murty, she's an Indian citizen and her father was also born in India. Now, when you file a tax return, if you're choosing to use that non-dom status, you tick a box, which means you do it on so-called remittance basis. So you pay tax on your UK income, and that's why you've decided to submit a tax return, so you're conforming with the laws of the land. But you're not offering HMRC any details about your worldwide income. That's a matter for the other countries where you might earn it or the different structures you might have for managing your tax affairs there. So it offers very little detail on your global income, and in a nutshell, it means those monies that you earn overseas, be they through shares, be they through another job, you don't pay tax on them here in the UK. There's a strange quirk to the non-dom system, which is that because it's existed for so long and it's really sort of a historical legacy, we don't actually know the cost-benefit analysis of the government in allowing non-dom status to continue. We know roughly how many non-doms there are each year because the Office for National Statistics gathers those numbers. So people submit their returns, the statisticians are able to work out how many people use it in the country. It's around 70,000, but it bounces up and down from year to year. But we don't necessarily know the clear cost benefits of having this special tax status here in the UK. There's obviously a lot of legitimate interest in Mr. Sunak and his wife's financial arrangements, in part because we're going through a cost of living crisis here in the UK, but also simply because they live in Downing Street. He is one of the most powerful people in the country. He's also responsible for tax policy. So to have his wife using a particularly beneficial, although entirely legitimate, tax policy here in the UK that's allowing her to save money on tax was perceived by some commentators as not being in the sense of fairness. Miss Murty's own statement said that she wanted to be seen to be embracing a British sense of fairness, and that's why, following our story, she decided she would no longer use non-dom status for tax purposes, specifically on her income. Of course, it could still save her a great deal of money in areas like inheritance tax, or if she or others who have used non-dom status were to, during that special period where they can use it, 15 years in the last 20, they were to set up a trust overseas that would then pay income from that trust as though that itself were a non-dom entity. Following the revelations about Miss Murty's tax status, I approached every cabinet minister in the UK asking them to explain whether or not they had themselves or their family members ever used non-dom status, or if they had any offshore trusts, so specifically trusts that might benefit from being placed in a tax haven. Following our revelation, it emerged that Sajid Javid had used non-dom status while he worked in finance, and that he had had an offshore trust while he was working as a private secretary in the Treasury, so while he held a post. That's not the same as quite being a high-up member of the government, so the requirements in terms of transparency are different. but some people felt that it presented a potential conflict of interest given he could have had some influence over Treasury policy. But he did follow the letter of the requirements when it comes to disclosure. I think what was particularly interesting through the course of my reporting is when I approached the whole of the UK cabinet, it emerged that just 3 cabinet ministers had, according to people familiar with their affairs, been prepared to confirm that they have neither used non-dom status nor overseas trusts to help minimise their tax bills. Non-dom is a status that you can elect to use and you tick a box on your tax return, and that means that you're saying my worldwide income isn't going to be taxable in the UK because I have this special status. That's really different to the use of a tax haven. You can be domiciled in the UK and still make use of a tax haven, which is generally defined as a place offshore where you might have close to zero income tax, but also a high degree of what's called banking secrecy. Working out who owns what when someone has set up an entity like a trust in a tax haven or they've set up a company there is very difficult, and that's something that the UK government is looking at and coming under increased pressure to better sort out. It's quite hard to build up a picture of exactly the hard and fast rules that are required for disclosure when it comes to the financial arrangements of the people running the country, cabinet ministers. A lot of it's determined by the most senior civil servants in their departments in the cabinet office, but also an independent advisor. I think sometimes as a journalist you find yourself reporting on areas where you have to question whether or not someone has broken the rules or whether or not the case that you're reporting on is a useful illustration of whether or not those rules might need to be considered. And I think it's really important to underscore that I'm not necessarily talking about people having done something that's illegal or against particular rules, more that is it possible within the rules we have to have potential conflicts of interest, and should we consider the transparency when it comes to disclosures that are required? Because ultimately a lot of that stuff may have been disclosed. It might be that the people in a certain government department who need to be in the know are, but that information isn't in the public domain. Having written about non-dom status and its uses in the UK, I started to turn my attention to a related field, and we recently broke an exclusive story about that. The term is Ghostdom, and it basically means that you are theoretically able to use non-dom status in the UK, but at the same time, while being resident here 365 days a year, you're also saying, I have zero UK taxable income. Now, this effectively makes you a bit of a ghost in the HMRC machine, which is why some people in the tax advice industry term it Ghostdom, because you don't have to submit a tax return. You're not a data point in HMRC's universe in the same way as you might be if you were just an ordinary non-dom. Now, while the name is very exciting and some pretty colourful characters by all accounts use this status, sometimes it's very ordinary people that also make use of it. They might have earned a lot of money overseas and they might choose to retire in the UK, but they've set up an offshore bank account that simply pays interest into a UK bank account, and that is not taxable as UK income, so they don't need to submit a return. But while it's an entirely legal status called 809E in the legislation, there's a shadier side to it, according to people familiar with the financial industry. That means it's often been used by kleptocrats, by people who might be considered in their home countries as meriting greater scrutiny from law enforcement or other authorities or intelligence services. Like non-doms, Ghostdoms don't have to provide any information on their worldwide income to the UK taxman. Now, because there's this extra layer of secrecy to it where they don't have to submit a return at all, we have no idea how many Ghostdoms are in the UK at all. We also have no idea how much money they might make worldwide, and it's very hard for law enforcement and for those constructing things like sanctions policy in Whitehall to work out where to start when investigating people that might make use of this status. Following our reporting on non-dom status, Labour said that they would scrap it and use a model such as the one used in Germany or elsewhere, where they allow for wealthy individuals to come and work in the UK for a while, but once they decide they're going to make the UK their permanent home, they have to start feeding in through the UK tax system like an ordinary person. With Ghostdoms, Labour have gone a bit further and they've said that this status is actually a national security risk because it allows potentially very high net worth individuals as well as entirely legitimate individuals to be this big black hole in our UK tax data. When I've talked to a host of figures across the City of London, and we've talked about non-dom status and we've talked about ghost-dom status, it's clear that both of these avenues are used by people from a range of what we might call not friendly countries. That would include Russia, but they've also pointed to figures from Kazakhstan and even from Iran, which is obviously a significant target for global sanctions, and in fact was one of the most sanctioned countries in history until the recent outbreak of war in Ukraine with Russia. So it's fair to say that it's been an area of concern amongst the best tax advisors in the UK, the best legal sets in the UK, but also UK authorities, intelligence services, agencies, and the wider infrastructure in Whitehall. At the moment, the UK's agencies who try and enforce sanctions or deal with criminal breaches, as well as the bits of Whitehall infrastructure that try and make sure that sanctions are in place and observed, have a complicated interrelationship. But in a nutshell, they say things like non-dom and ghost-dom status are really only scratching the surfaces of financial secrecy in the UK. While it's important from an emotional level, perhaps, for some individuals that people are seen to pay their fair share of tax here, it's part of a much bigger question about the transparency of money flows into the UK and how we might play a role in Britain as one of the world's great financial laundromats.